Welcome to Whispers of the Night. In today's episode, we join Poirot and Captain Hastings at the elegant seaside hotel of Belle Mer in Toqui, where a peaceful holiday turns into a grim investigation after a wealthy guest is found dead on his balcony with only 5 cigarette butts left behind to tell the tale. Your support truly warms my heart and inspires me to keep creating these stories for you. If you enjoy what you hear, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing the video with fellow mystery lovers. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from or share a thought about tonight's story. I always read your comments and truly enjoy hearing from you. Now, settle in with a hot cup of coffee. Stay curious and let's get started with the mystery of 5 cigarette butts. Chapter 1. The Belle Mer. You do understand, don't you? Said Mrs. Drake, her voice carrying that particular wariness which speaks of conversations repeated too many times, that Leonard will not tolerate any deviation from his established routines. The observation drifted across the elegant dining room of the Belle Mer Hotel with a sort of resigned precision that suggested years of careful accommodation to an inflexible temperament. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in observing the subtle dynamics of human interaction, I found myself uniquely positioned to appreciate the complex undercurrents that characterized this particular domestic exchange. My old friend Hercule Poirot and I had arrived in Toqui for what we anticipated would be a peaceful spring holiday drawn by the hotel's reputation for discretion and the restorative qualities of the Devon coast. The Belle Mer had been recommended by mutual acquaintances as an establishment that catered to guests of refined sensibilities, offering both comfort and that particular atmosphere of cultivated tranquility which marks the superior hotel. The circumstances that had brought us to this seaside refuge were themselves worthy of note. Poirot, after completing the rather taxing affair of the Whitehaven emeralds, had declared his intention to seek restoration for what he termed the little grey cells through exposure to maritime influences. The Sieur Moni, he had proclaimed with characteristic conviction, it possesses qualities most beneficial to the proper functioning of the intellectual faculties. I had been more than content to acquiesce to this plan, particularly given the rather oppressive nature of the London winter we had recently endured. The prospect of comfortable accommodations overlooking Torbay, combined with the opportunity for peaceful contemplation and perhaps some modest sea angling, held considerable appeal for one of my temperament and advancing years. The Belle Mer itself proved worthy of its distinguished reputation. Perched magnificently upon the cliffs with commanding views across the bay, the establishment presented an impressive facade of cream-cold stone, adorned with those ornate Victorian embellishments that speak of an era when architectural confidence was matched by abundant resources. The interior maintained standards befitting such an exterior with deep Persian carpets, polished mahogany furnishings, and an abundance of fresh flowers arranged with evident care and considerable expense. Our fellow guests appeared to represent precisely the sort of clientele one might expect at such an establishment. Individuals of obvious means and refined taste possessed of that particular quality of leisure which accompanies substantial financial independence. It was among this distinguished company that the conversation between Mr. and Mrs. Drake had captured my attention, revealing, as it did, certain tensions that seemed quite at odds with the peaceful atmosphere we had come to enjoy. The lady herself presented a study in carefully maintained dignity. Mrs. Hilda Drake appeared to be a woman of perhaps 50 years with iron-grey hair arranged in an impeccable coiffure that spoke of professional attention and considerable daily effort. Her clothing reflected expensive but conservative taste, suggesting a woman who understood the requirements of her social position while maintaining strict adherence to traditional standards of propriety. Her manner carried that particular quality of watchful attention which often characterizes wives of forceful men, a constant alertness to potential sources of displeasure, combined with the sort of practiced diplomacy that comes from years of managing difficult personalities. There was something in her bearing that suggested considerable strength beneath the surface difference, though she employed this strength primarily in the service of maintaining domestic harmony. The gentleman, who was the object of her solicitous attention, presented a marked contrast to his wife's subdued elegance. Mr. Leonard Drake possessed the sort of robust presence that immediately commanded attention in any gathering, with a flid complexion and forceful manner that spoke of commercial success achieved through personal determination rather than inherited advantage. His voice carried across the dining room with the authority of one accustomed to immediate compliance with his expressed wishes. "My dear Hilda," he replied to his wife's observation with the casual dismissiveness of long habit, "I should think that after 23 years of marriage you would have learned to manage such matters without requiring constant consultation." The rebuke was delivered with that particular form of public cruelty which some husbands employ as a means of establishing their domestic authority before an audience. I observed the way Mrs. Drake's already pale features grew perceptibly whiter at this casual humiliation, though she made no verbal response beyond a slight inclination of her head that might have been taken for agreement by those less observant than myself. Also present at their table was a young woman whose striking appearance made her an object of considerable interest throughout the dining room. Miss Elena Gray possessed hair that caught the morning light with remarkable effect, and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing of the complex interactions taking place around her. Her position as Mr. Drake's private secretary had been mentioned during the previous evening's introductions, though I suspected her responsibilities extended considerably beyond mere clerical duties. There was something in Miss Gay's manner, a particular alertness combined with what I could only describe as carefully controlled anxiety, that suggested her professional relationship with Mr. Drake involved complexities extending well beyond the ordinary bounds of employer and employee. The way her gaze moved constantly between the husband and wife, and the manner in which she seemed to anticipate Mr. Drake's requirements before they were expressed, spoke of an intimacy that might have caused comment in less sophisticated circles. The fourth member of their breakfast party was Mr. Anthony Vale, a gentleman of perhaps 40 years, whose expensive tailoring and careful grooming marked him as a person of substantial means and social ambition. He had been introduced as Mr. Drake's business associate, though I had detected certain undercurrents in their interaction that suggested their relationship might be considerably more complex than simple partnership would indicate. "I do hope," Mr. Vale was saying, with the sort of studied courtesy that barely concealed underlying tension, "that you will find the change of scene beneficial to your constitution. Drake, you have appeared somewhat out of sorts during recent weeks." Mr. Drake's response carried his characteristic bluntness. "My constitution requires no particular attention." "Thank you, Vale. Perhaps you might concern yourself more with your own affairs and less with matters that do not require your involvement." The exchange possessed that quality of superficial politeness that often accompanies deeper antagonism, suggesting business relationships strained by circumstances that extended beyond mere professional disagreement. I noted the way Miss Gay's fingers tightened around her coffee cup during this brief verbal sparring, and observed how Mrs. Drake's attention seemed to fix itself upon some distant point beyond the windows, overlooking the hotel's carefully maintained gardens. My contemplation of these domestic and professional tensions was interrupted by the arrival of another guest, whose personality immediately dominated the immediate vicinity. Colonel Hewitt announced his presence with the sort of hearty bonhomie that marks retired military officers of a particular type, settling himself at a nearby table with considerable noise and obvious satisfaction. "Magnificent morning," he declared to the dining room at large, his voice carrying the authority of parade grounds and mess halls. "Nothing quite like sea air to set a man up properly. Quite right to choose to key for your holiday, Drake. Quite right indeed." The various conversational threads continued to weave themselves throughout the elegant dining room as the morning progressed, creating a complex tapestry of social interaction that would later prove far more significant than any of us could have anticipated in those peaceful moments. For the present, however, it seemed merely the ordinary discourse of well-bred guests enjoying the superior amenities of a distinguished establishment. The sea breeze stirred the heavy curtains gently, carrying with it the salt tang of the ocean and the promise of restful days ahead, while somewhere among the careful conversations and studied courtesies, forces were already in motion that would transform our peaceful holiday into something quite different indeed. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The tranquil rhythm of our morning at the Belle Mer was shattered with shocking suddenness, when the sharp crack of breaking crockery, followed immediately by us. The woman's piercing scream penetrated even the thick walls and heavy carpets that had been designed to ensure the undisturbed comfort of the hotel's distinguished clientele. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in circumstances requiring immediate assessment and decisive action, I found myself instinctively alert to the particular quality of distress that such sounds invariably signify. The disturbance originated from the upper floors, carrying with it that unmistakable note of genuine terror which distinguishes true emergency from mere domestic mishap. I had been enjoying a leisurely second cup of coffee while perusing the morning edition of the Times, half listening to Poirot's characteristic observations regarding the psychological significance of breakfast preferences among the various personality types represented in our immediate vicinity. My friend's egg-shaped head lifted with that peculiar alertness which I had learned to associate with his professional interest in matters of human complexity. His green eyes took on that particular intensity which invariably preceded his most penetrating analyses of unusual circumstances. "Sacre," he murmured, setting down his coffee cup with the sort of deliberate precision that marked all his movements. "That cry, mon ami. It speaks not of simple accident, but of something far more disturbing to the natural order. Indeed, there was something in the quality of that scream, a note of profound shock, rather than mere physical pain, that set one's nerves immediately on edge. Throughout the elegant dining room, the gentle murmur of civilized conversation ceased abruptly, replaced by that uncomfortable silence which accompanies the recognition that something quite out of the ordinary has occurred. The normal sounds of a superior establishment, the discreet clatter of fine china, the measured footsteps of well-trained staff, the subdued rustle of newspapers being turned, gave way to an atmosphere of expectant unease. Several guests had risen from their tables with expressions of concern, while others maintained their seats, but displayed that particular quality of heightened attention which marks individuals suddenly conscious of their vulnerability to unexpected events. Within moments, we could distinguish the sound of urgent consultation in the corridors above, followed by the measured tread of what I took to be the hotel manager, ascending the stairs with that combination of haste and dignity which such circumstances demand. Pooh and I exchanged glances, and without the necessity for discussion, we made our way toward the main staircase. Experience had taught me that when my friend's curiosity was aroused by circumstances suggesting human drama of unusual complexity, it was invariably preferable to satisfy that curiosity promptly rather than to remain in ignorance while events unfolded beyond our immediate observation. The investigative instincts that had served us so well in previous affairs seemed to assert themselves with automatic authority. The scene that confronted us on the first floor was one of considerable agitation, yet maintained within the bounds of propriety that such an establishment demanded even in moments of crisis. A young chambermaid, a girl of perhaps 20, with the sort of wholesome prettiness characteristic of the Devon countryside, stood trembling outside one of the corner suites, her face white as the pristine linen she clutched in her shaking arms. Mr. Thornton, the hotel manager, presented the picture of professional competence under pressure, attempting to calm the distressed girl, while simultaneously maintaining the dignity and discretion befitting his position. His manner suggested a man accustomed to managing the occasional difficulties that arise in any establishment, catering to guests of particular refinement and substantial means. "Now then, Mary," he was saying in that tone of paternal authority which experienced managers employ with their younger staff, "you must compose yourself sufficiently to provide a clear account of exactly what you observed upon entering Mr. Drake's suite." The girl's response came in broken phrases, punctuated by involuntary gasps of distressed breathing. "Oh, sir, it's Mr. Drake. He's sitting there on his balcony, so very still, and when I called out my usual morning greeting, he never stirred, not even when I dropped the breakfast service in my surprise. Sir, it was at this moment that Poirot stepped forward with that quiet authority, which seemed to command immediate respect, regardless of the circumstances or the individuals involved. His manner carried the sort of professional competence that others instinctively recognize and defer to in moments of uncertainty. "Pardon?" He addressed the manager with characteristic courtesy. but perhaps it would be prudent to ascertain the gentleman's precise condition before attempting to extract a complete statement from this young lady who has clearly suffered considerable shock. Mr. Thornton's relief at having someone assume responsibility for the situation was immediately apparent. He led us without hesitation to the suite in question, a spacious corner apartment with French doors opening onto a private balcony that commanded a magnificent prospect of Torbay and the surrounding Devon coastline. The accommodation itself reflected the sort of understated luxury that marked the Belle Mer as an establishment of the first rank. Deep Persian carpets covered polished oak floors, while tasteful watercolors depicting local maritime scenes adorned walls covered in cream silk that complemented the mahogany furniture. Everything spoke of comfort, refinement, and that particular attention to detail which justified the hotel's considerable reputation. The scene beyond the French doors was both peaceful and profoundly unsettling. Mr. Leonard Drake sat in a wicker chair positioned to take full advantage of the magnificent view, his posture so natural and relaxed that for a moment one might have supposed him simply enjoying the morning air and contemplating the eternal rhythms of sea and sky. His hands rested easily upon the arms of the chair, his head tilted back slightly, as though he had been observing the flight of seabirds or the movement of distant sailing vessels. His expression held a serenity that seemed quite at odds with the forceful personality I had observed during our brief acquaintance at breakfast the previous morning. It was only upon closer examination that the true nature of the situation became unmistakably apparent. The gentleman's skin had assumed that peculiar waxy pallor which speaks unequivocally of death, while his eyes, though open and directed toward the horizon, held that fixed quality which no amount of wishful thinking could mistake for natural sleep or peaceful contemplation. There was no immediate sign of violence, no indication of struggle or disturbance. Indeed, had it not been for the complete stillness of his form and the unnatural color of his complexion, one might easily have taken him for a man deep in philosophical reflection upon the majesty of nature. Mr. Thornton, clearly shaken by this confirmation of his worst fears, began to speak of summoning the local constabulary and arranging for the proper authorities to assume responsibility for what appeared to be a case of natural death. However, Poirot raised his hand with that gesture of thoughtful restraint, which I had learned to recognize as the precursor to significant observation. "Among s'il vous plaît," he said quietly, his gaze already moving about the scene with that particular intensity which marked the beginning of his analytical process. "Before we disturb the natural arrangement of circumstances, it would be most wise to observe what story they might tell to those with sufficient patience to listen." It was then that my friend's attention became fixed upon a small side table positioned conveniently near the deceased gentleman's chair. Upon this table sat an ashtray of cut crystal containing what appeared to be the remains of several cigarettes. Even from my position near the French doors, I could observe that the butts were of different lengths and appeared to represent varying types of tobacco, though all had been extinguished with what seemed remarkable uniformity of method. Poirot moved closer to examine this curious assemblage, his sensitive nose wrinkling slightly as he bent over the ashtray, with that combination of professional interest and aesthetic distaste which characterized his approach to the physical evidence of human vice. "Most intriguing," he murmured, speaking more to himself than to the rest of us. 5 cigarettes, each different in character, yet each extinguished with identical precision. "And here, mon ami," he continued, addressing me directly, "we observe something most curious indeed." I found myself puzzled by this observation, particularly given my recollection of Mr. Drake's apparent abstinence from tobacco during our encounters. The gentleman had struck me as possessing that sort of vigorous temperance which regards smoking as an unnecessary indulgence, yet here was evidence of considerable consumption in what appeared to be his final hours. The morning breeze stirred the curtains of the French doors, carrying with it the salt tang of the sea and something else, a faint, bitter scent that seemed oddly displaced in the fresh coastal atmosphere. Chapter 3. The company at Belle Mer. The arrival of Inspector Davies of the Devon Constabulary brought with it that particular form of methodical efficiency which marks provincial law enforcement when confronted with what appears to be a straightforward matter of natural death. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in observing the various approaches that different personalities bring to situations requiring official attention, I found myself uniquely positioned to appreciate both the inspector's competence and his apparent haste in reaching conclusions. Clear case of heart failure, I should say, Inspector Davies pronounced with the confidence of a man who had encountered numerous similar circumstances during his career. Gentlemen of Mr. Drake's age and temperament, the excitement of travel, perhaps overindulgence at dinner, these factors combined most unfortunately in men of his constitution. Poirot maintained his characteristic diplomatic reserve during this assessment, offering neither immediate agreement nor contradiction to the inspector's conclusions. However, I detected in my friend's manner that particular stillness which invariably preceded his most profound observations, suggesting that his own evaluation of the circumstances differed considerably from the official interpretation. The inspector's departure left us in the curious position of unofficial observers to what had been classified as a routine occurrence, though Poirot's continued interest in various aspects of the scene suggested that our involvement in the affair was far from concluded. It was during this period of apparent calm that I had the opportunity to form more detailed impressions of the individuals who had comprised Mr. Drake's final social circle. My own connection to these unfolding events remained that of the sympathetic observer. Yet fate had conspired to place me at the very heart of what was clearly a complex human drama. The comfortable routine of our seaside holiday had given way to something that demanded careful attention to the subtle currents of emotion and motivation that flowed beneath the surface of civilized discourse. Mrs. Hilda Drake received the news of her husband's passing with a composure that spoke either of remarkable fortitude or of emotions long since disciplined into absolute submission. When we encountered her in the hotel's elegant drawing-room, some hours after the body had been removed, she presented the perfect picture of dignified widowhood, dressed in subdued colors that seemed to emphasize the careful pallor of her well-maintained complexion. The dynamics between the various members of this small society were as intricate as they were fascinating, each individual playing a carefully defined role in what had been the deceased gentleman's final social tableau. Mrs. Drake's position as the bereaved widow required her to maintain that particular balance between grief and self-control which well-bred ladies of her generation had elevated to an art form. Leonard had not been entirely himself these past months, she confided to Poirot when he expressed his condolences with characteristic gallantry. The pressures of business had begun to weigh most heavily upon his constitution. I fear the strain proved more considerable than any of us had fully appreciated. There was something in her manner, a careful modulation of sorrow that suggested long practice in the management of difficult emotions, that intrigued me considerably. Mrs. Drake possessed that particular quality common to wives of forceful men, the ability to maintain perfect equilibrium in circumstances that might reduce others to complete distraction. Her hands remained remarkably steady as she poured tea, and her voice held no tremor despite the morning's shocking discovery. Miss Eleanor Gray presented a marked contrast to her employer's widow in both temperament and emotional expression. The young woman's distress appeared genuine and profound, manifesting itself in a nervous energy that kept her in constant motion, adjusting her position, smoothing her auburn hair, touching various objects with unconscious frequency. Her striking appearance had made her an object of considerable attention throughout the hotel, yet it was her obvious anguish that now commanded sympathy. I found myself studying Miss Gray with considerable interest, for there was something in her manner that suggested depths beneath the surface of professional competence. Her position as private secretary to a man of Mr. Drake's standing clearly involved responsibilities extending well beyond mere clerical duties, and I detected in her careful responses a familiarity with her employer's private concerns that spoke of considerable trust and intimate knowledge. Mr. Drake had seemed quite himself at dinner, she said when Poirot inquired gently about her employer's apparent state of mind, her voice carrying that slight breathlessness which accompanies genuine agitation, perhaps somewhat preoccupied with certain business matters, but nothing that would have suggested any immediate concern for his health. Mr. Anthony Vale's reaction to the morning's events proved equally illuminating, though in quite different ways that spoke to the complex nature of his relationship with the deceased gentleman. When we encountered him in the hotel's well-appointed smoking room, he was engaged in the methodical consumption of what appeared to be his third whiskey and soda. Despite the relatively early hour, his usual polish remained intact. Yet there was something beneath the surface civility, a brittleness that suggested the morning's events had affected him more profoundly than he cared to acknowledge. The expensive tailoring and careful grooming that marked him as a person of substantial means could not entirely disguise the subtle signs of stress that his professional training had taught him to conceal. For Drake always drove himself beyond reasonable limits, he observed, accepting Poirot's condolences with the sort of practiced grace that marks the experienced businessman. Success in manufacturing requires a certain ruthless determination, and Leonard possessed that quality in remarkable abundance. The comment might have passed for ordinary social discourse, yet I detected in Mr. Vale's tone certain notes that spoke of experiences less than entirely pleasant. His business relationship with the deceased had clearly involved complexities extending beyond simple partnership, and his present circumstances seemed to provide him with opportunities for reflection that were not altogether comfortable. Dr. Felix Morton, whom we encountered taking his prescribed constitutional along the hotel's elegant terrace, proved to be a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, with the sort of precise manner that invariably marks the medical profession. His presence at Belle Mer, he explained with professional authority, was purely recreational, a much-needed respite from a demanding practice in exat that had begun to tell upon his own constitution. I had known similar men during my military service, physicians whose dedication to their profession had gradually eroded their own health through constant attention to the sufferings of others. Morton's careful attention to his prescribed routine of rest and moderate exercise suggested a man who understood intimately the requirements of physical restoration. "Most unfortunate business regarding poor Drake," he remarked when the conversation naturally turned to the morning's events. Though not entirely unexpected, I must confess, the gentleman struck me as the sort who demanded more of his physical resources than prudence would recommend. Dr. Morton's professional assessment carried the weight of medical expertise, yet I found myself noting the careful precision with which he spoke of the deceased. There was something in his manner, a studied objectivity that seemed almost excessive, that suggested his acquaintance with Mr. Drake might have extended beyond casual hotel encounters. Colonel Hewitt's response to the tragedy proved characteristically forthright, delivered in those booming tones that marked him as a man accustomed to addressing subordinates across considerable distances. We discovered him in the hotel bar, holding forth to anyone with an earshot about the particular stresses that attended modern commercial life and their unfortunate effects upon men of vigorous temperament. "Splendid fellow Drake," he declared with the emphatic certainty that military men often bring to civilian matters. "Understood how to achieve objectives efficiently, if you take my meaning. Cannot say I was entirely surprised by this morning's development, though the man drove himself like a cavalry charge, bound to exact its toll eventually." The colonel's forthright manner concealed, I suspected, a considerably keener understanding of human nature than his bluff exterior might suggest. His observations about the deceased carried the weight of substantial personal experience, and I detected in his seemingly casual remarks an awareness of tensions and complexities that a less observant individual might have missed entirely. As the day progressed and these various conversations accumulated in my memory, I found myself increasingly conscious of the intricate web of relationships that had connected these individuals to the unfortunate Mr. Drake. Each seemed to possess knowledge of aspects of his character and circumstances that, when considered collectively, painted a picture of remarkable complexity and considerable contradiction. The sea breeze continued to stir the hotel's carefully maintained gardens throughout the afternoon, carrying with it those timeless scents of salt and growing things that spoke of natural cycles far older and more enduring than the brief struggles of human ambition and disappointment. Chapter 4. Poirot begins. The curious circumstances surrounding Mr. Drake's sudden demise had begun to assume dimensions that extended far beyond the realm of simple misfortune by the time Poirot commenced his characteristically methodical investigation. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in matters requiring systematic analysis and careful attention to seemingly insignificant details, I found myself uniquely positioned to appreciate the subtle approach my friend employed when confronting situations of particular human complexity. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of the Bear's morning room, casting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and dance in harmony with the delicate undercurrents of unease that had settled upon the hotel's distinguished clientele. It was in this elegant chamber, with its cream silk wallpaper and carefully arranged displays of houseflowers, that Poirot began his inquiries with the sort of diplomatic precision that had served him so well throughout his remarkable career. My own connection to these unfolding events remained that of the careful observer, yet fate had conspired to place me at the very heart of what was becoming an increasingly intricate drama. The comfortable routine of our seaside holiday had given way to something that demanded the fullest exercise of those investigative skills that had distinguished Poirot's approach to criminal detection for so many years. Mrs. Drake had agreed to speak with him in the privacy of this refined setting, where the gentle sounds of afternoon tea service provided a civilized backdrop to what might otherwise have proven a most distressing interview. She sat with that perfect composure which spoke of years spent managing the social obligations that attended her husband's commercial success, her hands folded neatly in her lap, and her expression maintaining that careful neutrality which well-bred ladies employ in circumstances of particular delicacy. The dynamics of this initial interview were as fascinating as they were revealing, each exchange providing insights into the complex personality of a woman who had clearly devoted considerable energy to the management of a difficult marriage. Mrs. Drake's responses carried that particular quality of measured consideration which marks individuals accustomed to choosing their words with extraordinary care. "You must understand, Emoro," she began, her voice carrying those measured cadences of one who had long practice in navigating conversations of potential difficulty, that Leonard had not been entirely himself these past months. The strain of certain business complications had begun to manifest itself in ways that caused me considerable concern. Poirot inclined his head with that characteristic combination of sympathy and professional interest which marked his approach to such delicate matters. His manner suggested both genuine compassion for the lady's obvious distress and that keen analytical attention which he brought to all aspects of human behavior under stress. "Madame speaks of strain," he observed with gentle encouragement. "Perhaps you would be so kind as to elaborate upon the particular nature of these complications that troubled your husband so profoundly." Mrs. Drake's gaze moved to the windows, where the afternoon light illuminated the carefully maintained gardens and distant prospect of Tobay. Her hesitation suggested the sort of internal struggle that often accompanies the decision to reveal private matters to comparative strangers, regardless of their obvious competence and discretion. "There had been difficulties with certain business associates," she replied after a moment's careful consideration. "Matters involving contracts and obligations that Leonard felt had not been honored according to his expectations. He was not a man to accept what he perceived as betrayal or incompetence with any degree of patience." The delicate phrasing suggested depths of meaning that would undoubtedly require further exploration, though for the present Poirot merely nodded encouragingly and allowed the lady to continue at her own pace. His experience had taught him that premature questioning could often result in the concealment of precisely those details that proved most significant to a proper understanding of complex circumstances. Leonard had also developed certain habits that were quite unlike his usual temperament, Mrs. Drake continued, her tone suggesting a wife's familiar disapproval of alterations in established domestic routine. He'd begun to spend considerable time in solitary contemplation, often accompanied by the consumption of tobacco, which had never before been among his particular indulgences, and this revelation struck me as particularly significant, given my own observations of Mr. Drake's apparent abstinence from smoking during our brief encounters. The gentleman had impressed me as possessing that sort of vigorous temperance which regards such indulgences as evidence of weak character. Yet here was testimony to a marked change in his established patterns of behavior. I exchanged a meaningful glance with Poirot, whose expression had taken on that peculiar stillness which invariably preceded his most penetrating observations. The information Mrs. Drake had provided seemed to contradict certain assumptions we had formed regarding her husband's relationship with tobacco, creating questions that would require careful consideration. "The tobacco, madame," Poirot inquired with seemingly casual interest. It was of a particular variety, perhaps. Men who adopt such habits later in life often display decided preferences in such matters. Mrs. Drake's response came with the sort of domestic certainty that spoke of intimate familiarity with household details and personal habits. Leonard had always maintained a preference for Turkish varieties when he did occasionally indulge, though, as I mentioned, his recent consumption had increased most markedly from his usual abstinence. Following this interview, Poirot requested a private consultation with Miss Elena Gray, whom we discovered in the hotel's well-appointed library, seeking solace among the leather-bound volumes that lined the mahogany shelves. The young woman's distress remained evident in the way her hands trembled slightly as she attempted to focus upon what appeared to be an unread novel, her eyes holding that particular brightness which speaks of tears recently shed and emotions barely controlled. The library itself provided an appropriately dignified setting for such a conversation, with its atmosphere of scholarly quiet and intellectual refinement. The afternoon light filtering through tall windows created an environment conducive to thoughtful discourse, while the presence of so many volumes seemed to lend weight and significance to whatever revelations might emerge. "Miss Gray," Poirot began with that gentle authority which characterized his approach to interviews with individuals under emotional strain, "I hope you will forgive this intrusion upon your grief, but there are certain matters regarding your employer's final evening that might benefit from clarification." The young woman's response displayed that eager cooperation which often marks individuals genuinely anxious to assist in understanding tragic circumstances. Her manner suggested both professional loyalty to her deceased employer and personal distress at the unexpected termination of what had clearly been an important relationship in her life. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot," she replied with evident sincerity. "Anything that might help to understand what occurred, or that might provide comfort to Mrs. Drake during this difficult period." "You retired early from the company last evening, I believe?" Poirot inquired, settling himself in the chair opposite hers, with that careful attention to symmetry which marked all his arrangements of both objects and circumstances. Miss Gray nodded with apparent conviction, though I detected in her manner a subtle quality of nervousness that seemed inconsistent with the straightforward nature of the question. Indeed, I withdrew shortly after dinner was concluded. Mr. Drake had mentioned certain private business matters he wished to discuss with Mr. Vale, and I felt it appropriate to allow them their privacy for such conversations. "And the precise hour of your retirement, Mademoiselle?" "It must have been approximately 9, she replied, with what appeared to be certainty. I remember noting the time, as I had planned to write some correspondence before retiring for the evening. Yet, even as Miss Gray provided this seemingly straightforward account, I found myself recalling certain casual observations that had been mentioned by the hotel staff. The discrepancy was subtle but potentially significant, and I noted the way Poirot's attention seemed to sharpen almost imperceptibly at the confident precision of her response. The afternoon's interviews continued with similar careful attention to detail, each conversation revealing small complexities and curious aspects that seemed to accumulate like pieces of an intricate puzzle whose ultimate pattern remained tantalizingly obscure. The systematic manner in which Poirot collected these various testimonies reminded me of a master craftsman assembling the components of some delicate mechanism, each element requiring precise placement before the whole could function as intended. Chapter 5. Secrets Among the Smoke. The peculiar circumstances surrounding Mr. Drake's final evening had begun to assume the sort of complexity that I had learned to associate with affairs requiring my friend's particular expertise. As one who had observed the intricate workings of human nature through numerous cases alongside Poirot, I found myself uniquely positioned to appreciate the subtle undercurrents that were beginning to emerge from what had initially appeared to be a straightforward matter of natural death among the distinguished clientele of a superior hotel. My own connection to these unfolding events remained that of the careful observer, yet fate had conspired to place me at the very heart of a drama whose true dimensions were only beginning to reveal themselves. The comfortable routine of our seaside holiday had given way to something far more sinister, much as a peaceful landscape might suddenly disclose dangerous currents beneath its innocent surface. The investigation had reached that delicate stage where, seemingly, Innocent conversations began to reveal their hidden significance, rather like the gradual development of a photographic plate in a dark room, where shapes and shadows slowly resolve into recognizable forms. Each subsequent interview conducted by Poirot seemed to add another layer of complexity to what was becoming an increasingly intricate portrait of deception and concealed motive. It was during our second day of inquiries that the true nature of Mr. Drake's business relationships began to emerge with startling clarity. The dynamics between the various members of this small society were as intricate as they were fascinating, each individual having played a carefully defined role in what had been the deceased gentleman's final social tableau. Mr. Anthony Vale, when pressed with Poirot's characteristic diplomatic persistence, revealed details of their partnership that cast an entirely different light upon the deceased gentleman's recent state of mind. The elegant smoking room of the Belle Mer provided an appropriately masculine setting for such revelations, with its leather chairs, mahogany paneling, and discreet atmosphere of commercial confidentiality. The truth is, Poirot Vale admitted during our private conference, his usual polish showing signs of strain that spoke eloquently of sleepless hours and considerable anxiety. Leonard had become increasingly difficult to work with these past months. There were certain business decisions, significant ones, that had created considerable tension in our professional relationship. The admission came with evident reluctance, as though Vale recognized that his previous reticence had become untenable in the face of my friend's methodical questioning. He sat forward in his leather chair, the expensive tailoring and careful grooming that marked him as a person of substantial means, unable to entirely disguise the subtle signs of stress that recent events had produced. "The Whitmore contract," he continued, his voice dropping to that confidential tone which suggests revelations of particular delicacy, represented the culmination of 18 months of careful negotiation with our most important client. Leonard's decision to restructure the terms without consultation was both unexpected and, I must confess, financially devastating to my own interests. The implications of this revelation were considerable, suggesting motives that extended far beyond the realm of simple business disagreement. I observed the way Poirot's attention sharpened at this disclosure, though his expression remained one of sympathetic interest rather than professional suspicion. Miss Ella Lenana Gay's role in these complicated affairs proved to be far more significant than her modest title of private secretary might suggest. The young woman had clearly been privy to aspects of her employer's business dealings that extended well beyond ordinary clerical responsibilities, and her obvious distress seemed to encompass professional as well as personal concerns. When Poirot encountered her in the hotel's conservatory the following morning, her nervous energy seemed even more pronounced than previously, manifesting itself in that sort of restless movement which speaks of secrets poorly concealed and emotions under considerable strain. Mr. Drake had been receiving certain correspondence. She confided when Poirot's gentle questioning touched upon her employer's recent preoccupations, letters that seemed to cause him considerable distress and anxiety. He would read them in private and afterward remain closeted in his study for hours at a time, emerging in a state of obvious agitation. The young woman's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, and I noticed the way her gaze avoided direct contact with Poirot's penetrating eyes. There was something in her manner that suggested knowledge of matters extending beyond the merely professional, though the precise nature of these secrets remained tantalizingly unclear. The letters bore a London postmark, but no return address, she continued, her voice carrying that breathless quality which accompanies the revelation of carefully guarded information. And Mr. Drake was most particular that they should be handled only by himself. It was quite unlike his usual practice of delegating such matters to my attention. Colonel Hewitt's perspective on the deceased gentleman's character provided yet another piece of the increasingly complex puzzle that Poirot was methodically assembling. The colonel's military background had evidently provided him with insights into Mr. Drake's personality that proved both perceptive and somewhat disturbing to contemplate. Fellow had the sort of temperament that brooked absolutely no opposition, the colonel observed, with characteristic bluntness during our encounter on the hotel's elegant terrace, where the sea breeze provided a refreshing contrast to the intensity of our conversation. Useful quality in business, I suppose, but it tends to create enemies rather than friends among one's associates. The colonel's choice of words suggested knowledge of matters that he was perhaps reluctant to discuss in complete detail, though his subsequent observations proved illuminating in ways that would later assume considerable significance in our understanding of the case. Drake mentioned something at dinner about having to deal with certain presumptuous individuals who had forgotten their proper place. Hewitt continued, his tone carrying the authority of direct quotation and military precision. Used rather strong language about people who imagined they could take advantage of his generous nature. Not the sort of conversation one expects at a civilized table. If you take my meaning, Doctor. Morton's professional assessment of the various personalities involved provided what proved to be crucial insights into the psychological dynamics that had been at work during Mr. Drake's final days. The doctor's medical training had evidently equipped him with a particularly acute awareness of the subtle signs of stress and anxiety that might escape less observant individuals. The circumstances that had brought Dr. Morton to the Belle Air appeared to involve more than simple coincidence, though the precise nature of his connection to the deceased gentleman remained somewhat obscure. His presence during these particular days suggested either remarkable timing or a degree of planning that seemed inconsistent with his stated purpose of seeking rest and restoration. The gentleman was clearly suffering from considerable nervous tension, Dr. Morton confided when Poirot sought his professional opinion regarding the deceased's apparent state of mind. His sleep patterns had been severely disrupted, and he complained of persistent headaches that suggested prolonged periods of mental strain and emotional pressure. The doctor's observations extended beyond mere physical symptoms to encompass what he described as a marked deterioration in social behavior, evidenced by increasing irritability and a tendency toward what could only be characterized as paranoid suspicion of those in his immediate circle. Mr. Drake had begun to view every conversation as potentially threatening. Dr. Morton continued, his professional manner lending considerable weight to these assessments. It was the sort of psychological state that often accompanies individuals who find themselves in possession of dangerous knowledge or who believe themselves to be the target of hostile intentions. As these various testimonies accumulated throughout our investigation, I found myself increasingly conscious of the intricate web of relationships and hidden grievances that had surrounded the unfortunate Mr. Drake during his final weeks. Each conversation revealed new dimensions of complexity, suggesting motives and opportunities that extended far beyond the simple business disagreements that had initially seemed to characterize these associations. The careful precision with which Poirot collected and evaluated these various pieces of evidence reminded me of a master jeweler examining the facets of a particularly complex gem, each surface reflecting different aspects of the truth, while the whole remained tantalizingly elusive. Yet I sensed in my friend's manner that growing confidence which invariably preceded his most brilliant deductions. The sea breeze continued to stir the hotel's carefully maintained gardens as evening approached, carrying with it those timeless scents of salt and growing things that spoke of natural cycles far older and more enduring than the brief struggles of human ambition and revenge. Chapter 6. The Poison in the Tobacco. The peculiar circumstances surrounding Mr. Drake's untimely demise had long begun to assume dimensions far beyond those of ordinary misfortune by the time the chemist's report arrived at the Belle Mer. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in matters requiring careful observation and methodical analysis, I found myself uniquely positioned to appreciate the profound significance of what Poirot's investigation had uncovered during our seemingly peaceful sojourn in this distinguished seaside establishment. My old friend had dispatched the 5 cigarette butts to Mr. Pembroke, a distinguished analytical chemist of his acquaintance in tea, with instructions for the most thorough examination that modern scientific methods could provide. The morning when the results arrived found us in the hotel's elegant conservatory, where the early light filtering through the glass panels cast intricate patterns among the potted palms and climbing roses that the management maintained with such evident pride and considerable expense. The dynamics of this crucial moment were as fascinating as they were significant, representing as they did the transformation of our investigation from a matter of curious interest into something far more serious and potentially dangerous. The sealed envelope that contained Mr. Pembroke's findings seemed to carry with it the weight of revelation that would alter our understanding of recent events in ways we could scarcely have anticipated. Poirot examined the chemist's communication with that particular deliberation he reserved for moments of crucial importance. His egg-shaped head tilted slightly as though he could divine its contents through mere contemplation of the envelope's outward appearance. When he finally broke the wax seal and unfolded Mr. Pembroke's carefully penned report, his expression underwent that subtle transformation I had learned to associate with the confirmation of his most profound suspicions. "Wamon," he murmured, his green eyes meeting mine with an intensity that spoke of significant revelation and the opening of new avenues of inquiry. "Mr. Pembroke's analysis confirms what the little grey cells had already begun to suspect with increasing certainty. The implications of the chemist's findings struck me with the force of physical impact, transforming what had appeared to be a natural death, regrettable but hardly mysterious, into something that demanded the most serious attention from those equipped to understand its significance. I found myself recalling the peaceful tableau we had encountered on that balcony, with Mr. Drake seated so tranquilly in his wicker chair, facing the endless expanse of Torbay, as though he had simply chosen to contemplate the eternal rhythms of tide and weather. One of these cigarettes, Poirot continued with that methodical precision which marked his approach to all matters of criminal significance, specifically the third in the sequence, as I had arranged them for analysis, contains traces of hydrocyanic acid in sufficient concentration to prove fatal to a man of Mr. Drake's constitution and apparent state of health. My own connection to these unfolding events remained that of the careful observer, yet fate had conspired to place me at the very heart of what was clearly a most calculated and deliberate crime. The comfortable routine of our seaside holiday had given way to something that demanded the fullest exercise of those investigative skills that had served us so well in previous affairs of similar complexity and human significance. The systematic nature of this revelation forced me to reconsider every aspect of our investigation with newfound urgency and a deeper appreciation of the complexities involved. Each conversation, every seemingly innocent exchange, each subtle inconsistency in the various testimonies we had collected, all these elements suddenly assumed a significance that transformed them from curious anomalies into potential clues in what was clearly a deliberate conspiracy to commit murder. Prussic acid, I observed, the term emerging from some half-remembered military manual concerning chemical warfare and its various applications in both legitimate and illegitimate contexts. Swift and relatively painless, I believe, though hardly the sort of substance one expects to encounter in a gentleman's tobacco at a respectable seaside hotel. Poirot nodded gravely, his attention returning to the chemist's detailed analysis with that intensity which marked his complete engagement with matters of criminal psychology. Indeed, Hastings, and observe, if you please, the particular sophistication of the method employed. The poison was applied with considerable precision sufficient to ensure the desired effect, yet not so concentrated as to be immediately apparent to the victim or to those who might subsequently examine the evidence. The psychological implications of such careful preparation spoke to a criminal mind of considerable sophistication, one capable of planning not merely the immediate act of murder, but the subsequent investigation that would inevitably follow such an occurrence. The perpetrator had clearly anticipated the need to misdirect suspicion, using the very evidence of the crime to suggest possibilities and motives, quite different from the actual truth. Poirot's subsequent re-examination of the physical evidence took on an intensity that spoke of a mind fully engaged with the intricacies of criminal methodology and human psychology. He returned to Mr. Drake's suite, where the management had thoughtfully maintained the scene undisturbed, pending the completion of official formalities, and began a methodical re-examination of every detail, with the benefit of this new and crucial knowledge. The strand of orb and hair discovered upon the balcony rail, a detail that had initially seemed merely curious, now assumed potential significance as evidence of presence where none should logically have occurred, according to the various testimonies we had collected. Miss Gray's emphatic assertion that she had retired early from the company, combined with certain contradictory observations made by members of the hotel staff, created a pattern of deception that demanded the most careful analysis. "Regard mon ami," Poirot observed, indicating the position of the crystal ashtray relative to the deceased gentleman's chair and the careful arrangement of the surrounding furniture. The disposition here is most deliberate and calculated. Each cigarette has been extinguished with identical precision. Yet they represent 5 distinctly different varieties: Turkish, Virginia, Egyptian, Russian, and one unmistakably English brand. I found myself studying this curious assemblage with renewed attention and a deeper appreciation of its potential significance, noting the methodical spacing of the individual butts and the uniform manner in which each had been stubbed out. There was something almost ritualistic about the arrangement, as though the perpetrator had taken considerable care to ensure that this particular piece of evidence would tell a specific story to those who discovered it. "The sequence is most revealing," Poirot continued, his voice taking on that particular quality of concentrated analysis that marked his deepest intellectual engagement with criminal problems, suggesting not a casual social gathering, but rather a carefully orchestrated deception designed to obscure the true circumstances of Mr. Drake's demise. As the afternoon progressed, Poirot's investigation expanded to encompass a more detailed examination of each suspect's movements during the crucial hours surrounding Mr. Drake's death. The hotel's staff, when questioned with characteristic diplomatic persistence and considerable attention to detail, provided information that began to paint a picture considerably more complex than the simple domestic gathering it had initially appeared to represent. The night porter recalled observing unusual activity in the corridors during the small hours, footsteps where none should logically have been heard, the soft closing of doors at times when the hotel's guests should have been peacefully asleep in their respective accommodations. The chambermaid who had discovered the body spoke of finding the deceased gentleman's room in a state of unusual tidiness, as though someone had taken considerable care to arrange matters according to a predetermined plan. Dr. Morton's presence at the hotel, initially explained as a simple holiday for the restoration of his health following the demands of medical practice, began to assume more questionable dimensions when Poirot discovered that the doctor had specifically requested accommodation in close proximity to Mr. Drake's suite. The coincidence seemed remarkably convenient for someone supposedly unacquainted with the deceased gentleman's travel plans and personal arrangements. The careful web of relationships and hidden grievances that had surrounded Mr. Drake during his final days began to reveal patterns of deception and concealed motive that spoke to long-standing resentments and carefully nursed desires for revenge. Each individual's account contained elements that, while perfectly reasonable when considered in isolation, formed part of a larger pattern of calculated misdirection, when viewed as components of a coordinated plan designed to conceal the truth. As evening approached and the sea breeze carried the eternal sounds of waves against the Devon coast, I found myself increasingly conscious of the intricate nature of the crime that Poirot was methodically unraveling. The truth lay concealed behind layers of social convention and human complexity, waiting to be discovered by those with sufficient skill and patience to penetrate the carefully constructed facade of innocence that surrounded the guilty party. Chapter 7. The Little Grey Cells Speak. The curious circumstances surrounding Mr. Drake's untimely demise had reached that critical juncture where accumulated evidence begins to coalesce into patterns of undeniable significance. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in matters requiring systematic analysis and careful attention to the complex interplay of human motivation, I found myself uniquely positioned to appreciate the methodical precision with which Poirot had assembled the various components of what was clearly a most elaborate criminal conspiracy. The evening when my friend announced his intention to gather all concerned parties in the hotel's main lounge marked the culmination of an investigation that had revealed layers of deception far beyond what any of us might have initially suspected among the distinguished clientele of such a respectable establishment. The Bel Air's elegant drawing room, with its cream silk wallpaper and carefully arranged displays of fresh flowers, seemed an incongruously civilized setting for the revelation of such dark truths concerning human nature and criminal intent. My own connection to these unfolding events remained that of the sympathetic observer, yet fate had conspired to place me at the very heart of a drama whose complexity would have challenged even the most experienced practitioner of criminal detection. The comfortable routine of our seaside holiday had given way to something that demanded the fullest exercise of those investigative talents that had distinguished Pooh's remarkable career in the service of justice and truth. The assembled company presented a study in carefully controlled tension as they arranged themselves about the room in response to Poirot's courteous but firm invitation to attend what he described as a clarification of certain matters, requiring collective consideration. The dynamics between the various individuals were as fascinating as they were revealing, each person displaying those subtle signs of stress and anticipation that mark moments of profound significance. Mrs. Drake maintained her characteristic composure, though I detected in her manner that particular stillness which often accompanies the approach of events that will fundamentally alter one's circumstances. Her position near the windows overlooking the hotel's gardens afforded her a view of the peaceful landscape that seemed to provide some measure of comfort during what must have been an extraordinarily trying period. Miss Grey's nervous energy seemed even more pronounced than usual, manifesting itself in the restless adjustment of her position and the unconscious smoothing of her orb and hair. Her striking appearance, which had made her an object of considerable attention throughout our stay, now seemed somehow diminished by the weight of recent events and the obvious strain they had imposed upon her emotional equilibrium. Mr. Vale had chosen a chair that afforded him clear observation of the entire assembly, his usual polish intact, but somehow less convincing than it had appeared during our earlier encounters. The expensive tailoring and careful grooming that marked him as a person of substantial means could not entirely disguise the subtle signs of anxiety that recent developments had produced in his generally confident demeanor. Dr. Morton occupied a position that reflected his professional training and natural inclination toward strategic assessment of social situations. His medical background had evidently equipped him with that particular awareness of human psychology under stress that proved valuable in circumstances requiring careful observation and analysis of group dynamics. Colonel Hewitt's military bearing remained unchanged throughout these proceedings, though I noted the way his keen eyes moved constantly about the room, missing nothing of the various interactions taking place around him. His straightforward approach to complex situations provided a refreshing contrast to the more subtle maneuvering that characterized the behavior of the other participants. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular authority which invariably commanded immediate attention regardless of the circumstances or the nature of his audience. "We are gathered this evening to discuss a matter of considerable gravity. The deliberate murder of Mr. Leonard Drake through the administration of prussic acid concealed within a cigarette." The stark declaration sent a visible tremor through the assembled company, each individual reacting according to their particular temperament and degree of involvement in the affair. The transformation of what had been considered a natural death into confirmed murder created an atmosphere of heightened tension that spoke to the serious nature of the criminal act we were addressing. Mrs. Drake's composure remained intact despite this shocking revelation, though I observed the slight tightening around her eyes that spoke of emotions carefully suppressed through years of practice in managing difficult circumstances. Her reaction suggested either remarkable self-control or a degree of prior knowledge that distinguished her response from those of her companions. Miss Gay's reaction was more pronounced, her face paling to an extent that suggested genuine shock at this confirmation of what had previously been mere suspicion among the hotel's guests and staff. The young woman's obvious distress seemed to encompass both professional loyalty to her deceased employer and personal concern for the implications of such a revelation. "The evidence," Poirot continued, with methodical precision that reflected his complete mastery of the case's complexities, "speaks most eloquently of a crime planned with considerable sophistication and executed with remarkable attention to detail. The 5 cigarette butts discovered in the deceased gentleman's ashtray represent not merely the detritus of an evening social gathering, but the carefully crafted components of an elaborate deception designed to obscure the true circumstances of Mr. Drake's demise." My friend's exposition proceeded with that characteristic combination of logical analysis and psychological insight that had distinguished his approach to criminal investigation throughout our long association. The systematic manner in which he detailed the significance of each piece of evidence demonstrated the thoroughness that had enabled him to penetrate the complex web of relationships and hidden motives surrounding this particular crime. The revelation of Miss Gay's predicament began with Poirot's characteristically diplomatic exposition of the financial pressures that had driven her to seek assistance from her employer in matters extending beyond the normal bounds of professional relationship. The young woman's brother, it emerged, had become involved in certain irregularities at his place of employment, irregularities that threatened not only his career prospects but his personal liberty should they become subject to public scrutiny. Mademoiselle Grey Poirot continued with evident sympathy for her difficult position, found herself in circumstances that many young persons of principle discover when family loyalty creates obligations extending far beyond their natural capacity to fulfill through conventional means. Mr. Drake's offer of assistance came accompanied by expectations that proved increasingly difficult to satisfy. The precise nature of those expectations remained delicately understated in deference to the lady's feelings, though the implications were sufficiently clear to those with adequate experience in such matters. Mr. Drake's reputation for identifying and exploiting the vulnerabilities of others had evidently extended beyond the realm of business into areas of more personal manipulation and control. The tragedy of this affair, Poirot observed, his tone taking on that particular gravity which marked his most profound insights into the darker aspects of human nature, lies not merely in the commission of murder, but in the psychological complexity of motives that led to such a desperate resolution of intolerable circumstances. The psychological portrait that emerged from Poirot's careful analysis revealed depths of calculation and long-suppressed resentment that had transformed a seemingly ordinary domestic situation into the setting for a crime of remarkable sophistication. The various threads of evidence and human emotion had combined to create a pattern of cause and effect that spoke to the profound consequences of sustained psychological pressure and moral compromise. As Poirot's explanation unfolded with inexorable logic, the true complexity of the relationships among our small company became increasingly apparent. Each individual had played a role in the circumstances that led to Mr. Drake's death, whether through active participation, passive enablement, or unwitting contribution to the pressures that had ultimately proven fatal to the deceased gentleman. The sea breeze continued to stir the hotel's gardens, as evening settled over to carrying with it those timeless scents of salt and growing things that seem to emphasize the eternal cycles of nature in contrast to the temporary nature of human conflicts and criminal conspiracies. Chapter 8. The Ashes of 5 Cigarettes. The extraordinary circumstances surrounding the revelation of Mrs. Drake's carefully orchestrated crime had cast a peculiar atmosphere over the Belle Mer during our remaining days in Toy. As a retired military officer with considerable experience in matters requiring delicate handling and careful observation of human nature under extreme duress, I found myself uniquely positioned to observe the various reactions of those who had unwittingly participated in what would undoubtedly become one of the most remarkable criminal cases of my association with Hercule Poirot. The curious circumstances that had led to this dramatic resolution possessed a complexity that spoke to the intricate nature of human relationships and the profound consequences of sustained psychological pressure within the confines of domestic life. Mrs. Drake's transformation from devoted wife to calculating murderer represented a phenomenon that challenged conventional understanding of criminal behavior among the respectable classes. My own connection to these events had evolved from that of the casual observer to something approaching that of a witness to history, as one might unexpectedly find oneself present at moments that would later be recognized as pivotal in the understanding of human psychology and criminal methodology. The comfortable routine of our seaside holiday had given way to insights into the darker aspects of human nature that few are privileged to observe at such close quarters. The dignity with which Mrs. Drake faced the consequences of her actions proved to be perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire affair. When Inspector Davies arrived to escort her to the local constabulary for formal questioning and inevitable prosecution, she received him with the same quiet composure that had characterized her behavior throughout our investigation, displaying that particular form of aristocratic bearing which maintains its essential character even under the most trying circumstances. Poirot's final explanation had revealed the true sophistication of her plan with startling clarity. Mrs. Drake had not acted in sudden passion, but had carefully prepared for months, obtaining the pryke acid through her late father's medical connections. He had been a country physician with access to various chemical preparations. Her knowledge of Miss Gay's smoking habits and her husband's established patterns of behavior had enabled her to devise a method that would eliminate him while casting suspicion upon the young secretary. "I had hoped," she said to Poirot, as the inspector waited respectfully in the hotel's entrance hall, "that exposing Leonard's true nature through such circumstances might serve to protect Miss Gray from further exploitation, even if it could not restore her brother's position or her own peace of mind." Her words carried the weight of genuine conviction, suggesting a moral framework that had guided her actions even in the commission of murder. The psychological complexity of her motivation spoke to depths of suffering that had gradually transformed a once devoted wife into an instrument of calculated justice, according to her own distorted perception of moral equilibrium. The revelation of how she had accomplished the deed proved as ingenious as it was chilling. Mrs. Drake had prepared the poisoned cigarette weeks in advance, knowing her husband's habit of accepting offerings from those seeking his favor. When Miss Gray, in a gesture of reconciliation, following another of their increasingly frequent disagreements, had offered him one of her Turkish cigarettes, Mrs. Drake had smoothly substituted the prepared one from her own case. After his death, she had methodically smoked 4 additional cigarettes of different brands obtained during shopping expeditions to various tobacconists in Torquay to create the false impression of a social gathering that had never actually occurred. The strand of auburn hair had been deliberately placed, by pulling it from Miss Gay's coat during their supposed comforting embrace upon discovering the body. Miss Eleanor Gray's relief at her exoneration was evident in every aspect of her demeanor during the days that followed. The nervous energy that had characterized her behavior since Mr. Drake's death gave way to a more natural composure, though I detected in her manner a profound sadness that spoke eloquently of the moral complexities surrounding her employer's demise and her own unwitting role in the tragedy. "I cannot pretend to mourn him as I ought," she confided to me during a chance encounter in the hotel's garden, where the sea breeze stirred the carefully maintained plantings with gentle persistence. "Yet I find myself deeply troubled by the knowledge that my own desperate circumstances contributed to such a tragic resolution of what should have been a simple matter of justice through proper legal channels. The young woman's predicament had been resolved through the intervention of a local solicitor, who arranged for her brother's debts to be settled through more conventional means, though the shadow of recent events would undoubtedly follow her for some considerable time. Her position with the Drake business interests had naturally terminated, but recommendations from unexpected quarters had secured her employment with a firm of considerable respectability. Mr. Anthony Vale's reaction to the revelation of Mrs. Drake's guilt proved particularly illuminating, suggesting depths of understanding that he had previously concealed with remarkable skill. The business difficulties that had strained his relationship with the deceased gentleman suddenly appeared in a different light, revealing a pattern of exploitation and manipulation that extended far beyond mere commercial disagreement. Dr. Morton's professional assessment of the psychological dynamics involved provided valuable insights into the long-term effects of domestic tyranny upon even the most resilient individuals. His observations suggested that Mrs. Drake's transformation had been a gradual process shaped by years of accumulated humiliation and the steady erosion of her natural moral restraints under the pressure of intolerable circumstances. Colonel Hewitt's forthright military perspective on the affair proved characteristically direct, though not without a certain grudging admiration for the tactical sophistication that Mrs. Drake had displayed in planning and executing her husband's elimination with such methodical precision and attention to detail. As Poirot and I prepared to return to London, the Belle Mer had begun to resume its normal character as a refined establishment, catering to the leisure requirements of distinguished guests. The staff spoke in hushed tones of recent events, but already the hotel's efficient management was working to restore that atmosphere of peaceful elegance that had originally attracted us to this particular corner of the Devon coast. Our final evening at the Belle found Poirot and myself on the hotel's terrace, contemplating the endless expanse of Tobay as the setting sun painted the waters in shades of gold and crimson. The 5 cigarette butts that had provided the key to solving Mr. Drake's murder had long since been consigned to the evidence files of the Devon constabulary, but their symbolic significance lingered in my memory like the ghostly after-image of a profound revelation about the capacity for both suffering and calculation that lies dormant within the human heart. The case had revealed truths about human nature that I found both disturbing and oddly reassuring, demonstrating once again that beneath the veneer of civilized behavior lay depths of emotion and motivation that could transform the most unlikely individuals into instruments of both justice and vengeance, depending upon one's perspective on the complex moral questions that such circumstances inevitably raise. Thank you for listening to The Mystery of 5 Cigarette Butts here on Whispers of the Night. Poirot reminds us that even the smallest clue, something as ordinary as a handful of cigarette butts, can expose the darkest truths hidden beneath polite society. If you enjoyed today's mystery, please subscribe for more twisted detective tales and share this story with fellow lovers of intrigue. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Alfie signing off from Whispers of the Night.